Hey, as we start out 2020, welcome. So glad you're here. We're actually going to be starting a sermon series in the book of Ruth. And the book of Ruth is actually one of, if you know anything about the scriptures, and if you're someone who's not religious, welcome. So glad you're here. The scriptures, most of us might think of the scriptures as being kind of this religious work that's full of all these codes and laws. And that's certainly a part of the scriptures. But actually, the scriptures are a collection of 66 books. And many stories and genres of the 66 books are narratives, are stories of real people like you and I who are going through kind of the humdrum of life and some of the difficulties and the ups of life as well. And one of the books that we've been given is this book of the book of Ruth, a book of a story of this woman named Ruth and this Moabite woman, which you'll hear about, and really kind of how God works in the midst of real lives. And so I'm excited to tackle this book and look at this story, this beautiful, magnificent narrative of this woman named Ruth, and you'll see how her story is interweaved in kind of the grander scheme of what God is doing. But it comes to us in a context where you see a person named Naomi who's actually looking for deliverance. And one of the things that we're going to be exploring today is this idea of deliverance. And how does God come to us and deliver us sometimes? What's the mechanism by which he comes to us? And so we're going to start in the beginning of the story here. And check out the story, because from the beginning, you see the scene of this dramatic tale of this woman named Ruth as well as Naomi. Now, check this out. It says, in the days when the judges ruled, now, if you know anything about kind of ancient history, and especially the history of ancient Israel, Judges was a time in which there was all sorts of chaos. It was conflict-ridden. There were all sorts of people that were kind of lost, and there was all sorts of disarray within society. So immediately, as an ancient listener is listening to this, immediately he basically says, in the time of Judges, immediately someone's anxiety begins to increase and starts to think, oh man, this is a time of disarray, a lot of conflict. And it says there was a famine in the land. Now, a famine, of course, it means that there was no food there. And so as a result, in the midst of a time of Judges, and in the midst of a time where there's famine, you can imagine then the plight of the people who are going through tremendous burden and difficulty. Now, check out what it says. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, so someone who's an Israelite, together with his wife and his two sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Now, do you get the scene then? There's disarray politically, socially in this time of Judges. There's a famine, and as a result, because of this famine, this family, by this man, his wife, and his two sons, they're forced to flee as refugees. Now, this is different than simply being immigrants. Of course, immigrants have the agency to choose where they're going to immigrate to. Now, of course, this doesn't minimize the experience of immigrants, but what this does is it adds the layer of difficulty and confusion. Can you imagine for a refugee? They're forced to flee because of this famine. So already then, there's kind of this, at the very beginning of this narrative, there's this sense of someone named Elimelech, or this person who's got a wife and two sons. They're already in this tremendously difficult circumstance, and it just keeps getting worse. Now, check out what happens. The man's name was Elimelech. Now, the word Elimelech, the name, and in the ancient world, names meant a whole lot. Elimelech basically means God is king. The Lord is king. So there's this entire kind of subtext here of, here's this man whose name means God is king. God is overall. God is ruler. Now, Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi. Now, Naomi, the word Naomi or the name Naomi means pleasant. Now, keep this in mind as we continue on in the story. And the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion, which I'll talk about in a bit. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. So do you see the context then? There's Judges, there's chaos, there's famine. Elimelech, whose name is, the Lord is king. He's married to Naomi, who's pleasant, and with their two sons, they're going to this foreign land because they're forced there because of hunger and famine. So, because they're refugees. And so, and now, as someone who grew up in an immigrant household, my parents, they grew up in Korea, but they immigrated from this war-torn country. They immigrated to the States. Like, I know the difficulty of being an immigrant and some of what they went through with the language barrier, the customs, everything was so new and different. You know, they would constantly face racism and difficulty in the neighborhood that we grew up in. Like, can you imagine that? So, like, in many ways, immigration can be somewhat traumatic. But can you imagine as a refugee who's forced into this situation? There's famine. And so this family then is thrust into this very unenviable circumstance of being foreigners and refugees in a land of Moab. So immediately, as a listener to this story, one is continually like, oh my goodness, the sympathy that goes out to this family. But check out what happens. Now, Elimelech, the Lord is king. That's his name. Naomi's husband, who is pleasant, he died. Oh man, do you get the sense of what's happening? The Lord is king has just died. And look at what happens. It just keeps getting worse. And she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women. Of course this would happen, right? Because they're refugees. They're in this foreign land. Whatever hopes that they had that somehow her sons, that Naomi's sons would marry these nice Jewish Israelite boys, that doesn't happen. So of course they have to marry Moabite women. And that's who these foreign women who are different than them. One named Orpah. We get the name Oprah from no, I'm just kidding, we don't. Just want to know if you're paying attention. And the other named Ruth. So there are these 2 foreign women who are not part of the lineage, but they're Moabites, and they get married to these 2 sons after they had lived there about 10 years. Now you can imagine for Naomi, for a woman in that context, the only kind of social capital or way of advancement or having a life of flourishing, the only way that one could have that. Now I know that this might be hard to believe, but in those ancient times, they had these archaic ways of the only way that a woman had any kind of social capital was to be married to this flourishing family. And so you can imagine for Naomi, she's a widow. So people already think of her as someone who's not blessed by God. There's very little advancement in her life. And she's got these 2 sons, though. Now, here's the clue from the text, though. Both Mahlon, now the name Mahlon, that name means infirmity. Now, scholars have noted that these probably weren't the 2 names of the sons, because who would name their son infirmity or sickness, right? But Mahlon is the name of the first son that's given. Mahlon's the first, and notice, Mahlon actually dies, and Chilion also dies. Now, Chilion, the name Chilion actually means destruction. So you can imagine these clues then that this text is giving. By the way, so if you were thinking, oh man, I really like that name Mahlon, that's what I want to name my son, or Chilion, don't do that. Because these names, they basically mean infirmity, sickness, and destruction. Now, these names are basically clues of the plight of this woman, Naomi. So can you imagine? Like, basically what the text is telling us is, Elimelech, God is king, that's dead. Whatever hope you had in God, that's dead. And by the way, the sons, the only thing that you could cling to, the fact that you had these cherished boys. These boys have now also died. Infirmity and destruction. This woman, Naomi, her life has just gotten worse. And if you can imagine for her, right, the story started with famine. At least she had her family. Story starts with her being a refugee. At least I've got my husband and my 2 boys. And almost immediately, there's a story of, no, God is king is dead. And Mahlon, your son, is dead. And Chilion has died. And all she's left with, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them. So somehow, in the midst of one of the most difficult circumstances, she hears that God has somehow brought some deliverance back home. So she had been a refugee. She hears this, and it makes sense. She's lost almost everything. And look at what happens. She and her daughters-in-law prepare to return home from there. And as she goes home, when she goes back to Bethlehem, so the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. In other words, why was there this stirring? And the women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Can this be pleasant? Now, they're asking this question because Naomi, this pleasant woman who was married to Elimelech, God is king. This woman, she's back, but she's lost her husband. She's lost her 2 sons. And look at what she says. You know what? Don't call me Naomi. Don't call me pleasant. She told him, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full. You know it, I know it. Everyone in this town knows it. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi or pleasant? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Now, this story just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And what's interesting about the end of chapter 1, it's this story where it begins where, wow, there's famine, there's judges, and already there's this clue of like incredible difficulty for this family. And then kind of it continues in chapter 1, and it just keeps getting worse and worse for Naomi. She's pleasant. Her husband's name was Elimelech, and Elimelech has died, signifying for her kind of her hopes being dashed. And now she's got these two boys who are the ones that she clings to for hope, and yet these two boys also die. And she comes back to her home, and she's basically like, hey, don't call me Naomi anymore. Don't call me pleasant. Call me bitter. Because this is what God has done to me. This is how the Lord has afflicted me. Now, there are some rumors kind of around the world that somehow what Christianity offers us is this beautiful life and kind of this perfect sheen where your life, and maybe you came to church today and you're like, you've got this brand new resolution. I'm coming to church because I want to get rich and wealthy and kind of have God bless me. And you know what the amazing thing is about the stories, like I mentioned, the multiple narratives that we find in Scripture, is that they're often stories of people a lot like Naomi. Stories of incredible heartbreak, stories of great difficulty and suffering. And if there's anything that the beginning of this story is revealing to us, it's this. It's that faith is for the brokenhearted. And I know we haven't gotten to the good news yet. And some of you are like, yeah, this is kind of a depressing story to start 2020 with. Well, welcome, because here's one of the principles. Faith is for the brokenhearted. It's for anyone who's ever experienced a broken heart. And for someone like Naomi, who's undergoing incredible grief and loss and difficulty, like the story is here because it's the story of regular human life. And the reality is, wherever you are, whatever your background might be, whether you're young, you're old, you're single, you're married, you're divorced, you're widowed, whatever your plight, whatever your situation, here's the reality, is that whatever your socioeconomic status might be, every single one of us have experienced a broken heart before. We've experienced the pangs of disappointment, of wondering why kind of a dear friend's health is fading or a family member's health is fading. We've experienced the pangs of being heartbroken, of being lonely, of feeling lost, of wondering, of maybe one day of saying to the heavens, just call me Mara, call me bitter. Have you ever been there before? And maybe even as we enter into this new year, there's this kind of belief like, life is going to be up. That's what I got to believe, and that's what I got to know. And I hate to burst your bubble, but here's the thing. Every single one of us at one point in our lives, and at one point or another, this year in 2020, maybe even it's already been in the last 5 days, you've probably experienced the sinking feeling of loss and grief or of difficulty. And you're like, Drew, why are you preaching on this to start the year? Well, because guess what? Faith is for you. Faith is for you. And the story of God is a story for you, whether you're religious or you're irreligious. You know what's interesting is that in the book of Ruth, God is not talked about very often. In fact, the people refer to God and the Lord, like you mentioned, like Naomi basically says, the Lord has afflicted me. She'll talk about the Lord, but in terms of what God is doing, it reads like a story of basically like, where is God in this? Because God's not mentioned at all. God's not directing events. God is simply present in the midst of great pain. And what this first chapter is basically setting the scene for is this, is that in the story of Naomi, who goes from pleasant to bitter, faith is for her. And here's what I want you to know. Faith is for anyone who has experienced a broken heart. And the reality is every single one of us have experienced a broken heart at some point or another. Now, some people might say, oh yeah, Christianity, it's just for people who need a crutch. And I say, absolutely. That's absolutely true. It's for people who realize that life is full of all sorts of difficulties, stumbling blocks, pain and suffering that no amount of wealth, no amount of kind of privilege can somehow get rid of. You know, Jim Carrey, the actor and former comedian who, I shouldn't say former, but actor and comedian, I guess because he does more dramatic films now, but Jim Carrey, he's got this phrase where he says, I wish everyone could become rich and famous so that they can realize that that's not the answer. Now, isn't that interesting? Even the rich and famous. And this is why, if you have ever wondered, like, why is it that even the wealthy and even the kind of the people with great fame and fortune, why do they struggle with depression and anxiety and difficulties? Why? It's because suffering and difficulty and pain and a broken heart befalls us all. You and I, and every single one of us will be there one day. But the good news is this. Faith is for you. Faith is for me. Faith is for the brokenhearted. Now, what's fascinating about this story is that the deliverance, the way that God will move in this story, comes about much differently than we might expect. You see, because the story is named after this woman, Ruth. Remember I told you Naomi, who's pleasant, she's left with her 2 daughters-in-law. And the reality is for Naomi, there's really no kind of benefit for both Naomi as well as her daughters-in-law, for Orpah and for Ruth. There's really no benefit for them to be together because, again, the only capital that a woman could have is being married. And so Naomi knows this. She heard about the aid that's coming back home, so she's leaving. And then there's this story in chapter 1 where when she's leaving, look at the dialogue that she has with her daughters-in-law. Check this out. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living in Moab and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, and this goes at some of the character of Naomi here. It says, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. Now, why is Naomi saying this? Of course, because Naomi's looking out for them. She's like, listen, there is no social capital that you have. If you want to have a flourishing life, you're much younger than I am. Go and get married to someone in your homeland because that's the only way that your life will flourish. You certainly don't need to stay committed to me. Now, look at the back and forth that happens. Then she kissed them goodbye and they wept aloud and said to her, we will go back with you to your people. I mean, do you imagine? Do you see the anguish? We've been through so much together. There's no way we're leaving you. We will go back together. And then look at what Naomi, who's pleasant, says. Naomi said, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Back in the ancient world, if a son died, it was the belief that somehow the daughter-in-law would have to marry the next son. Because again, this was the only way to have social capital. And she says, am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you because the Lord's hand has turned against me. So do you see what's happening? Naomi's like, I'm going to leave. I'm giving you your out right now. And these women who are part of this ancient culture are like, no, we're going to stay with you. We're going to stay with you. Now, coming from a culture where in the Eastern world, again, I came from this immigrant background, so I know this culture of loyalty and kinship. And here it is, right on display. Orpah and Ruth are basically, no, we're going to stay with you. And Naomi's like, are you crazy? Why would you do this? Your life is basically so much better if you just stayed and get another husband. And so, knowing this culture of intense loyalty, I know that in that kind of culture, there's all sorts of innuendo and indirect communication. So for instance, say I'm really hungry and I enter into a home in kind of, a home of an Eastern family that the way that we communicate, and they basically ask me, are you hungry? And I'm like, oh, no, I'm not really hungry. I know this game, right? I'm not really hungry. And they're like, oh, your stomach just growled. Oh, no, that just means that I'm really happy. I know this indirect game, right? And they're like, oh, are you sure you're not hungry? I'm like, no, I'm okay. And then that person will basically say, well, you know what? I have this ham sandwich that I'm just going to throw away if someone doesn't eat it, so I guess I'll just throw it away then. And then, of course, I'll be like, oh, no, I'll take it. And then they'll give it to me. And I'll be like, right? And I'll be like, oh, that was good. Right? Because, that's kind of how, I know the culture that I grew up in, which has this intense loyalty. And so I can almost imagine this scene, right, with Orpah and with Ruth and with Naomi. Naomi's like, hey, you guys can leave. You don't have to stay committed. It's better for you to go. And Orpah and Ruth are like, oh, really? Really, Naomi? No, we're going to stay here with you, And then there's this moment, and Naomi's basically, no, what are you thinking? Like, your life will be so much better if you leave here. And what the text tells us is, at this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. So I can imagine Orpah being like, really? Oh, Naomi, yeah, okay, bye-bye. I got, right? And in many ways, I can relate to Orpah. Like, Naomi's just giving her an out. You can't blame either of them. You can't blame Orpah. You can't blame Naomi. Orpah's simply just doing what she knows she can do, and Naomi's giving her permission. Now, in the midst of this, Ruth clung to her. And the word for clung is the same word for cleaving in Genesis when it talks about marriage, when a man and woman cleave to each other. Ruth clung to Naomi. And look at what it says. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. She gives Ruth another out. But look at what Ruth says. Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely. Now notice she invokes the Lord. She's this Moabite foreigner. She says, may your God, may the Lord deal with me ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Now, this is such a crazy dramatic turn in the story. Because here's this woman, Naomi, who's gone from pleasant to being bitter, who's lost everything. In fact, she's lost everything so much. She's lost all kinds of hope for her broken heart. She gives the two things that she has left, her daughters-in-law. She gives them an out. And Orpah has left. But there's one woman, this foreign woman, who knows nothing of God, knows nothing of the Lord. And yet there's this woman named Ruth who clings, who stays. And it's this immigrant Moabite woman who will bring about deliverance for her. You see, in the midst of this chapter of chapter 1, that feels incredibly demoralizing. There's this one truth that emerges, and it's this truth. It's that, you see, it's persevering friendship that heals a broken heart. There's a woman named Ruth who, through the ups and the downs, through Naomi's difficult state and circumstance, that God will bring about his deliverance. And there's this clue that it's in persevering friendships that heal a broken heart. Now, you and I know this, don't we? We know that it's those friendships, it's those meaningful relationships that have been with us in the worst of times, in the most difficult times, that have somehow met us and transformed us. Henry Nouwen, in his book Out of Solitude, here's what he says about friendship. He says, when we honestly ask ourselves which person in our lives means the most to us, or mean the most to us, we often find that it is those who, instead of giving advice, solutions, or cures, have chosen rather to share our pain, to touch our wounds with a warm and tender hand. The friend who can be silent with us in a moment of despair or confusion, who can stay with us in an hour of grief and bereavement, who can tolerate not knowing, not curing, not healing, and face with us the reality of our powerlessness. That is a friend who cares. Because here's the reality. Every single one of us, we know like the experience of loneliness and brokenheartedness. And I dare to say, whether you're religious or you're not, that every single one of us, the relationships that have been most meaningful in our lives have been the ones that have stuck with us when we were at our worst. And I think for anyone who gains any amount of social capital, or maybe like if you're wealthy, or maybe you've kind of grown in stature, there are these hints, and when I talk to people, there are these hints like, do people really love me and for who I am, or do they love me for what I give them? Especially in this town, right? Isn't it, there's all sorts of suspicion. Do you love me because of how I look, or because of how wealthy I am, or because of whatever I can offer you, or do you really love me? And really, the evidence of whether that friendship is real is whether they've stuck with us in the worst of times. And what Nouwen talks about, and what Ruth is demonstrating, is that it's persevering friendships that heal a broken heart. It's the people that have clung to us, have encouraged us in the worst of times, that actually changes our lives. I was reading this article about LeBron James earlier, and LeBron James, if you don't know who he is, I can't help you. He's like a very popular basketball player, and anyhow, so LeBron, he's actually married to his high school sweetheart named Savannah Brinson. And LeBron, someone's really excited about that. And one of the things I was reading about LeBron, and he married his high school sweetheart, and one of the things that he wrote, he said, "She has been with me," because they met when they were teenagers. And so before he became this super duper mega star basketball icon, he wrote, she's seen me when I was a nobody. And like there's just something about that texture when any one of us can know that, right? Like, and hear that. Like, yeah, there's something beautiful about that, because LeBron, he, as he's grown in wealth and popularity, that same instinctive questioning, does this person like me because what I can give to them or what I can do? But it's someone who's known me and cared for me at my worst. And what Ruth is demonstrating to Naomi is that persevering friendship is really what heals the broken-hearted. It's those people who have been through it with us in the midst of when we were going through a season of infertility. It's the people who have been there for us and sat with us and listened to us and hugged us, reminded us when we were going through breakups and lonely heart, when we were going through all sorts of turbulent seasons of our career and financial pressures. It's those people who have stuck with us, been kind to us. It's those people, isn't it, that have really helped to heal a broken heart. And this is what Ruth is doing for Naomi. She's saying, hey, where you go, I will go. I'm going to be with you. It's in the midst of this. It's in the midst of Naomi, whose life has gone from pleasant to bitter, that we have this one ray of light, this one kind of note that gives us hope. And it's a persevering friendship of Ruth. The question for you and the question for me is, who is that person for you? Or here's another question for you maybe, is how can you be that person for someone else? When I was last year, I was away on sabbatical during the summertime, and then I came back, and you were probably like, whoa, there's a lot happening. Right when Drew came back, whoa, we're in this building campaign, and we've got this new church in Chelsea, and my life became very full. I went from sabbatical to like, oh, we're very full. Now here we are, going Midtown, and it was, Sundays were pretty difficult for me, and maybe I didn't show that to you all regularly. I was preaching, and we were in the For the City campaign, but it was like wrought with a lot of stress and nervousness. And so my Sundays, basically I would come here and then I'd preach in the mornings and we'd have our meetings and stuff. And then I'd go to Chelsea And in Chelsea, we were going through some pretty challenging circumstances as we were helping to relaunch that church. And so I would often come home on Sunday nights from Chelsea, and to kind of make myself feel better, I would buy a chicken sandwich from Popeyes because there was one right across the street. So, sorry, that's inconsequential to this story, but nonetheless, but it shows you what I was, and so Sunday nights were hard, and my kids were just, I usually could kiss them goodnight and like be able to say goodnight to them, and then, Sunday nights were just really hard, and then Monday mornings I would get up and I'd take our son David to the bus stop, and anyhow, part of my regular rhythms, though, was on Monday mornings. There's another family where their children go to the same school as David, our son, and at the same bus stop. It's William and Melody Mack. And so William and I, we would get together most Monday mornings, and what we would do is, so we would say goodbye to our kids as they got on the bus stop, and then we would just go to breakfast. And one of the most healing things for me was to be able to go to breakfast with William and to just vent and to just share like some of the difficulties, the weightiness, the stress, the trials, the difficulties that I was facing myself. And, as kind of Christmas came upon us, and I just had some time to reflect on this past semester, and I'm feeling energized for this new season and this new year, and I was just thinking, wow, there's a lot that happened over the last few months, and like, how in the world did kind of I make it through? And as I was kind of pondering and reflecting on that, I just realized it was these Monday breakfasts where a persevering friend was there to help heal a suffering, broken heart. And I'm so thankful to God for William, and I'm so thankful to God that he gives us these gifts of one another. Now, here's what I know, though. In a city like this, we are so self-sufficient. We all kind of think, oh, everyone else has it all together. I don't want to bother anyone, and nor do I want to overextend myself because I don't want them to take advantage of me. And so as a result, we've got all of these kind of self-sufficient types who are fearful of saying, number one, I need help, or fearful of just taking a step out and basically saying, hey, can I help you? And so we're stuck in this conundrum then. We all know the importance of this, of persevering friendships. But for many of us, we don't know how to actually reach out to someone for persevering friendships without being weird, like being like, hey, can you be my friend? Can you be a persevering friend for me? Right? And some of us are just like, we're fearful that if someone asks me that, they're like, no, actually, I can't commit to that. I can maybe commit to one text a month maybe, or I don't know, whatever it might be. But so we find ourselves in this conundrum, don't we? There's a theologian named Winnie the Pooh. And Winnie the Pooh, A.A. Milne has this quote from Winnie that says, you can't stay in your corner of the forest waiting for others to come to you. You have to go to them sometimes. I mean, isn't that true? We're just a bunch of these isolated individuals who are fearful of taking a step out. Some of us are isolated individuals, fearful of anyone asking anything of me. And so as a result, we're stuck in this conundrum. And here's what Winnie the Pooh's basically say, hey, sometimes you got to leave your forest. And maybe you have to be the one to step out and say, hey, either I need help or, hey, I just want to encourage you and I want to bless you. When I was in seminary, and seminary is this graduate program for people who are studying theology and stuff. So when I was in seminary, there was this interesting kind of social dynamic that occurred on our campus. And again, here we are, grown adults in graduate school, studying to be like leaders of congregations and ministers for the gospel of Jesus Christ. So here we are, and in the dining hall, now the student body was like 85% white, and it was like 15% like Asian American. And so some of you are like, where are the other people of color? I know the seminary needed a lot of work. But anyhow, that was the dynamic. Now, so here's the thing, right? So I'd go into like the dining hall, and there was this stark contrast. So like walk into the dining hall, and of course, all the white students would like sit together. And then all the Asian students would kind of sit together. And it was just this dynamic. And here we are, grown adults, believing in the gospel of Jesus, and still this social dynamic existed. And so I remember, I would float around between both sometimes. And so when I would go to this group, I remember thinking, this is not right. We need to do something. And so, hey, let's have a forced mixer. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't do that. Because we're all grown adults here. But I would go to this group and I would sit down and we'd be talking and I'd be like, hey, I was just wondering, do you notice the stark racial divide that exists within this dining hall? And they're like, oh yeah. But they don't want us to sit with them. And I was like, oh. Yeah, and so that's why, they just want to sit by themselves, and that's why I was like, oh, okay. Oh, I'll take that information. That's interesting that you think that. So then I would go, and I'd go to the Asian group, right? And I'd be like, hey, have you noticed, there's this stark divide, this racial divide happening within the dining hall of future ministers of America, And they're like, oh, yeah. I don't think they want us to sit with them. And I just don't think they want to. I would sit with them, but they don't want me to sit with them. So I was like, oh, that's so interesting. Now, a part of me was just and I remember telling this to both. I just wanted to stand with a megaphone and be like, hey, everyone believes about the other that they don't want you to sit with them. And so here we are then, we're in this conundrum. And here's what Winnie the Pooh says. Sometimes you have to leave your forest to go to another. Sometimes when you're going through difficulty and pain, you need to actually get up out of your pew and come up for prayer. Sometimes when you are dealing with the pangs of your own loneliness, you need to put away your Netflix and you need to reach out to somebody and you need to maybe join a home group. Sometimes when you and I are going through, you need to get out of your forest and go to another. And I think we're stuck in this conundrum because the culture around us will tell us, oh, no, just turn to Netflix to medicate. Or turn to, the pharmaceutical industry for help because that will help you. And meanwhile, we've got all these people dealing with loneliness, anxiety, pain, and no one dares to be a persevering friend for another. And here's what I want to invite us to as we begin this new year. Will you be a persevering friend? Maybe for some of us, you realize you're going through it. You're going through the pain. Maybe you're going through relational issues, and it's been hard as hell. And today, I want you to say, will you leave your forest, and will you ask for help? Maybe some of you are going through a season of loneliness and difficulty. Will you leave your forest? Will you come up for prayer? Some of us are going through physical infirmities, and will you leave your forest? Now, on the flip